All right, let's dive right in. We're going to unpack one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in modern history, Venezuela's terrifying descent into hyperinflation. It's a wild story about a nation that was blessed with incredible wealth, but it's also a really stark lesson in the brutal choices policymakers face when an economy starts to spin completely out of control.
Now, this quote, it's not actually about Venezuela. It's about Germany, way back in 1923. But it perfectly captures the final, terrifying stage of an economic nightmare. That moment when a country's own money becomes so worthless that people just turn to a foreign currency to get through the day.
And that's really the heart of it all. See, hyperinflation isn't just about prices skyrocketing. It's a fundamental breakdown of trust. It's that moment when an entire population just collectively decides their own currency isn't worth the paper it's printed on, and they'll do pretty much anything to get rid of it. So how on earth did Venezuela, a country literally sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, get to this point? Well, the story starts not with scarcity, but with the strange paradox of having way, way too much of a good thing.
The root of the problem is this economic concept called Dutch disease. Think of it like a star athlete who only ever practices one move. I mean, that one move is amazing, but when the game changes, they have absolutely no other skills to fall back on. For Venezuela, that one move was oil. The flood of oil money made their currency so strong that it just became cheaper to import everything else than to make it at home. Farming, manufacturing, you name it, it all just kind of withered on the vine.
And this slide, wow, it just lays the result out in really stark terms. What you're looking at here is private investment as a piece of the whole economy. See how it peaks during that big oil boom in the late 70s? But then it just falls off a cliff. This graph basically asks us, why would anyone invest in a new factory or farm when you just can't possibly compete with cheap imports? The engine of a healthy, diverse economy just seized up. So let's break down the symptoms. First, the entire economy got hooked on oil revenue. The currency was always way too strong, which made it impossible to sell anything else to the world. So all the money and talent just shifted into sectors that serve the oil industry, and pretty soon the country was totally dependent on imports for even the most basic goods. Venezuela was basically de-industrializing before it ever even got a chance to fully industrialize. Okay, so the stage was set. You have this really deep structural weakness baked into the economy. All it needed was a shock to ignite the fire. Now let's see how this vulnerability slowly built into decades of spiraling inflation. And this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn, a creeping disaster. Back in the 70s, inflation kicked up to 6%. Manageable, maybe. But then in the 80s, boom, it triples to over 19%. By the 90s, it had more than doubled again, averaging nearly 50% per year. You can just feel the foundation cracking long before the whole building came down. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it connects all the dots for us. It starts with that oil boom in the 70s, which leads right to Dutch disease. That created all the structural weaknesses that led to decades of high inflation. But the final trigger, the thing that pushed it over the edge after 2012, was this growing reliance on the black market exchange rate. So when the 2014 oil price shock finally hit, the whole system just collapsed into hyperinflation. And this is what collapse looks like. 720%. That was the estimated inflation rate for just one single year, 2016. Prices weren't just rising, they were exploding in a way that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. So here's the crucial point. The government kept insisting the currency was worth one thing, but on the street, everybody knew it was worth far, far less. So businesses started pricing your goods based on the black market rate for the dollars they needed to import stuff. This created a death spiral. Everybody expected the currency to fall, which drove the black market rate higher, which drove prices higher, which just confirmed that, yep, the currency was collapsing. The Venezuelan story is obviously an extreme case, but it shines a huge spotlight on a universal dilemma. When inflation starts to surge, what are policymakers actually supposed to do? They face this series of just brutal trade-offs with no easy answers at all. Let's step into their shoes for a minute, using an analysis from the European Central Bank as a guide. For a central bank, your main weapon is the interest rate. But the question is, how exactly should you use it? So here's the choice, and it's a tough one. You can be aggressive and hike interest rates fast. That'll probably stamp out inflation quicker. But the risk? You could slam the brakes on the economy so hard you cause a recession. The alternative is a delayed, gentler approach. That might soften the blow to the economy, but it runs the huge risk of letting inflation get baked in for the long haul. It's a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario.
But it's not just central banks in the hot seat. Governments have their own set of tools. They can try to ease the pain by cutting taxes, sending checks to everyone, or maybe focusing that help only on the people who need it most. They could even pour money into big infrastructure projects. The real question is, which of these is the smartest play?
This chart is super revealing. It shows the long-term impact on a country's debt depending on which tool you use. And look at this. The broad, untargeted stuff, like tax cuts and cash for everyone, causes the biggest jump in debt. But carefully targeted help and smart public investment, they provide relief while being much less damaging to the nation's finances down the road. The choice of tool really matters. So what does all this mean? Where does it leave us? It means that navigating an inflation crisis is an incredibly delicate, high-stakes balancing act. And as the European Central Bank puts it, there's no single magic bullet here. The only way through is with an appropriate mix of policies, a coordinated dance between the central bank and the government to fight inflation without completely crushing the people they're supposed to be helping. And this table adds one final crucial wrinkle. Your starting point, how much debt you already have, changes the entire equation. For a country already deep in debt, an aggressive rate hiking campaign is financially devastating. It causes a much larger spike in their debt. Their room for error is practically zero. And that brings us right back to Venezuela. The crisis there wasn't the result of one bad decision. It was the result of decades of ignoring these exact trade-offs, of letting that Dutch disease fester, of papering over huge structural problems until there were simply no good choices left. It is the ultimate cautionary tale. And that leaves us with a critical question for today. As many countries around the world are grappling with their own inflation problems and rising debt, are their leaders learning the lessons from Venezuela? Are they making the tough, balanced choices that are needed, or are they planting the seeds of a future crisis?